Think Outside the Lines is a space for anyone ready to stop checking boxes, to step off autopilot, and create the life you actually want, with clarity, intention, and alignment. Whether you're questioning the default path, rebuilding from scratch, or just looking to feel a little more like yourself. My guest today had his first panic attacks at 17, in the middle of a life that looked completely fine. For nearly a decade, he treated anxiety as something to manage, white-knuckling through it, building a successful career on top of it, hoping it would eventually let go. It didn't. What he found instead was something slower and more uncomfortable than a breakthrough. That understanding yourself and actually living differently aren't the same thing. Join me as we think outside the lines with Brian Sachetta.
All right, Brian, I'm really excited for this conversation today because I think this is a topic that will resonate with a lot of people. You put into words something that I think a lot of people feel but can't really articulate. You said that for nearly a decade, you treated anxiety as something to manage rather than something to understand. That distinction really struck me because I think a lot of people are probably living with similar feelings, perhaps without even realizing it. Tell me a bit about your journey that kind of led you to that realization.
Yeah. It's going to be hard for me to even jump in just because there's so many different points, right? I think about that journey itself and I'm like, where to begin, you know? But what I would say, right, is, and I'm not trying to discount any of the work that I've done or like, you know, I will be talking or referring to my first book a little bit in the sense that like in that book, right, I have this thing called the 10 steps to getting out of your head. So it's like anxiety mitigation in the moment. And I really do think that those tools are helpful. I use them a lot and a lot of other people do, right? At the same time, that is a little bit more of the management side of things. And for me, especially, and I know a lot of folks too, right, is like I'll call that sort of, I don't know if it's anxiety 101, but it's earlier stages, right? Of like, okay, I now even know what I'm dealing with, as in this is anxiety, and I'm identifying things that are helpful for me in the moment to manage that anxiety. But let's say a decade goes by, 5 years go by, and all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, I've been doing the deep breathing for like 5 years now, and I've been doing the meditating for like 7 years now, and I do my mantras and all that. Eventually you sometimes hit a wall where you're like, did I do everything surface level? Was there more here that I needed to discover? And I think you start to see this just in pop culture in general, right? Where like people are becoming a lot more interested in different routes towards healing. I think about, you know, you're in LA, there's a lot of psychedelic use out there, right? Where some of it is just recreational, having fun, that kind of thing. But other parts of it is like, I really want to know what's going on. And the brain is such a fascinating and at times terrifying organ where if you've ever done psychedelics before, especially if you do something of a therapeutic dose, a hero dose, whatever, your brain is very quickly going to show you things that you have suppressed for most of your life, right? And it doesn't always mean that, you know, you were subjected to some horrific tragedy when you were 5 years old, but it might just be your defenses coming down long enough for you to see that you run certain patterns. And that's the understanding piece, is to say, oh, I am continually pulling people out of the river, so to speak. I'm kind of going off of an analogy that people sometimes give, when what I really need to do is I need to go upstream and figure out why people keep jumping in the river in the first place, right? I don't want people drowning. So if I tell them to stop, you know, jumping into this deep and dangerous river, then maybe we'll actually get somewhere.
Yeah, there's so much there. I think so. One of the things that I really latched onto early on when you started talking was just the notion that there's like basic things that you can do to manage it. But once the avoidance aspect kicks in, which I want to start to talk a little bit about later in the conversation, it's almost too late to use any of those tricks, right? Because you've kind of surrounded yourself in this safety bubble where you don't even go out anymore, right? And so then your tips and tricks don't really work. And so I want to dive into that a little bit. I guess before you understood the difference, what did managing it look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was those in the moment methods, which again, they have their time and their place. And honestly, I think they are very valuable for people. But to your point, the difficulty is that sometimes you pull those methods out at the same time, or after you've already hit a 9 out of 10 on the anxiety scale, right? And like you said, it's kind of too late. I think some of that, there's kind of two prongs there. One is just the fact that like the timing isn't great, but also part of that is like there has to be something going on underneath the surface that is deeper, that if you are waiting to get to 9 out of 10, then maybe your anxiety is kicking in too fast and it is unmanageable. And I know we're throwing that management term around a lot, but like, right, if you are going from 0 to 9 or 1 to 8 or whatever on in terms of the experience of anxiety in the moment, that is telling you something as well, which is, right, it's like if you are instead being like, I started at a 2 and now I'm at a 4 or a 6, yeah, that's uncomfortable, but you are going to retain the wherewithal to be able to pull out those steps and do the quote unquote management piece. Whereas if you're going from a 0 to a 9, which doesn't always happen, but like if your body is actually kicking into gear that fast, there is no time to do the management piece. There is no time to have the wherewithal, right? Because if you go back to thinking about the hardware that's running in our bodies, like that 0 to 9 is the equivalent of saying, I'm in front of a tiger that's about to eat me. I need to run for my freaking life. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I guess to back up again, kind of just for a second, like you alluded to the trauma aspect of things, or potential, like the psychedelics piece is where you start to unpack some of that trauma potentially, right? I do believe that everyone has trauma. Maybe it's not like a specific incident in your childhood, let's say, right? But we all experience different variations of trauma throughout our lives. To what extent have you found that impacts like longer term anxiety in people?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's such a broad subject. It's hard to give a specific answer. But I think it affects a lot of people, right? I was listening to a book recently talking about, psychedelic therapy, and they were saying, we traditionally think of trauma as going to war, seeing somebody die, being in a horrific accident, but trauma is more a process that happens to your nervous system, right? And when you're getting that constant and intense rev up, you can often be emitting a trauma response, which is basically your nervous system saying, I did not calibrate properly over the course of my life. I do not know how to handle these smaller stressors. And they might not be small, but I think one thing that is funny, right, is like in my own journey, I have seen, right, so I write a lot about my own struggles with intimacy and on the dating front and whatnot. And I remember, like, I'm not trying to cast any shade here or anything like that, but reading some of the reviews of one of my books, and one guy was like, wow, this guy has serious issues, like he's nervous to go on a date, like, listen buddy, the world's got real problems, try going to war or something like that. And I was like, you're missing the point, right? And it's not about me, it's about the mechanism in general. Is if somebody's body is emitting that response where it's like, this feels like a tiger, this feels like war, even though it's actually not, that brain, that body, that nervous system is picking something up and saying, like, I do not feel safe in this situation. And then the sort of disparity there is the work that we need to do to unpack and kind of uncover what's going on, what's driving the response. And what I mean more concretely there, right, is like in my situation, if I'm having panic attacks when I'm going into intimate situations, that's my nervous system saying, I don't know how to handle intimacy. And then, going back and figuring out, why did I not know how to deal with intimacy? What happened in my life that made it such that every time I get in a room with somebody, like I'm sweating bullets and I feel like my life is about to end, right? That's the work that psychedelics can often help reveal to you, and saying like, oh, these are some of the events that occurred in my life, or these are the recurring patterns that come up and up again. And if I don't do the work to resolve them or make peace with them, I'm going to find myself going from 0 to 9 in a lot of situations that, to an outside observer, they'd be like, that's an outsized reaction. You shouldn't be having that. You know what I mean?
Well, it's also subjective, right? And I think that's the thing that a lot of people don't understand about folks that have anxiety. It's that it's often, as you put it, kind of situational, right? So like something that might be super easy for me might be really challenging for someone else, and vice versa, right? Like getting on an airplane is something that I have like terrible anxiety about, right? Not so much the dating thing, but the airplane, right? And you might be someone that can get on an airplane easy. And that terrifies me. Like on a travel day, I think it's really interesting what you said a minute ago, because it's like at the end of that travel day, my nervous system is shot, and I can say that and understand what that means. But I can say that to someone else and they might not have a clue as to what I'm even talking about. Right. So I'm fascinated by these circumstances by which anxiety surfaces in our lives.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because it's crazy to think about the disparity that you just mentioned, right? Where like we could say to each other, maybe I'm kind of, putting words in each other's mouths, but we could say we each deal with anxiety, right? And then I could look at the fact that, and I also don't love flying, so maybe it's a bad example, but I could theoretically be like, hey, there's something that I do that I don't even think twice about that keeps you up at night, and vice versa. And that is that's one of the most fascinating things in the world to me, because that says our nervous systems are calibrated in different ways. They are prepared for certain things. They see threats in certain things and not in other things, right? And so that goes back to sort of the programming, the training, if you will, of, hey, what were your experiences like earlier in life? I remember when I was a kid, my parents sometimes would have the TV on, and then the TV, if we were watching a sports game or whatever on Sunday night, it would transition into 60 Minutes. And 60 Minutes at the time, like I just remember being 7 years old and seeing some segments where specifically they were like, oh, flying in a plane isn't safe. And they had somehow, I don't even know how they had it. They had a video of being in a cockpit and like the pilots piloting the plane and the thing just like nosediving, and to me, that was the scariest thing in the world as a 7-year-old. And so it's like, yeah, you combine that with the fact that you see these scary news headlines, and, airline travel is still the safest form of travel in the world, but your brain starts to just look at those scary and negative things. And all of a sudden you see how you then have a neural net, which is like, don't get on that friggin' plane. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think for me too, I'm curious about your experience, and we could probably turn this whole conversation in this direction. But for me, it's always been things that like I used to be able to do that now are exponentially more challenging than they used to be. Like that's something that I can't wrap my brain around ever, because I hate to say I suffer from anxiety. I live with anxiety. I manage my anxiety. But that's one aspect of it that will forever confound me, because I don't understand why there's things that I used to be able to do, let's say 10 years ago, even, right? 5 years ago, that absolutely terrify me today.
Yeah, I would like to try to talk about this. I don't know. I don't have an agenda as to where it will go, but I've seen this in my own life as well, right? Something that jumps out to me is like when I was in my 20s, right? I think most people in their 20s, like, if you were lucky enough to like live near a city and like go out to the bars and stuff like that, or go to college, a lot of us were kind of idiots, you know what I mean? And we'd be 22 at the bar, like getting really drunk and doing stupid things. There's a certain point in time, and it's not just drinking, it's not just your social life, but as you get older, right, you start to learn some more of the social norms, and all of a sudden, the things that you used to see in a certain fashion, you can't see them in that fashion anymore, and you now can't unsee the fashion in which you now see them. So specifically,
is it fair to say you become less reckless?
I think you do. Not everybody, maybe not everybody, but I do think that in a way, right, like you gather more data points as you get older. And I don't mean this politically. I just mean this in terms of like your processing is you probably become more conservative as you get older, because you think to yourself, I've seen all the ways that this could go wrong. Whereas when you're 22, you're like, everybody's an idiot. I know what I'm talking about. The problem is that you haven't seen that much of the world, right? So like your reference points are small. So if you're like, it always goes this way, your quote unquote always is actually, you've seen it go that way 4 out of 4 times rather than, 7 out of 100.
Yeah, that's actually so fascinating to me, because I've also seen exponentially more newscasts since then, right? I've synthesized more of the world experience than I did back then. And so I've actually never looked, I love epiphanies like that, because I've never looked at it from that perspective before. Like, well, I just have more information now than I did then, and that's why I'm more secluded.
Yeah, for sure. And
or
right,
whatever,
like,
right?
I think one of the other things on this thread too is like, if you are honest with yourself, as you go to these different experiences, and I'll stay with the thread of socializing, drinking, whatever, is there becomes a point in time at which you can't refute the evidence in front of you, right? Like maybe for a long time you can't, but let's just say, you're going out for a while, you're in your 20s, and you see a bunch of people around you acting like idiots, right? And you're like, look at that idiot and look at that idiot. Oh my goodness, I can't believe he did that at the bar. I can't believe he walked up to those people and annoyed them and whatever. And then when you kind of start to think about it, now, not everybody is doing all of those things throughout their lives, but like, there will be some instances where maybe a friend says, oh my goodness, this guy came up to me and he was so annoying and whatever. And then eventually you're like, oh goodness, I've done that before. I've been that person.
Am I the annoying one? Yeah,
totally. Exactly. And that's where you're just like, oh goodness, I don't think I can see any of this in the same light anymore.
Well, and I look at something like dating is a perfect example, right? Because I have so many friends in like now their 30s and 40s that I think it's sort of this hybrid of like just not enjoying it as much as they used to, right? Because there's like different expectations now and the world has changed and there's apps and there's, all these things, right? But to your point, it's also like I'm thinking of it now through that lens of like, oh, well, they just have so much more information. Like you can only go on so many bad dates, right? And have so many like shitty experiences where it's so fascinating to me.
Sure is.
I think anxiety to me feels like one of those words that I think we just use it so broadly that I think people stop hearing it, especially in 2026. Tell me how you define it. Maybe not clinically, but like from your perspective.
Yeah. And I think it's a good segue because one thing I like to always say is like, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychiatrist. I can't really go on the medical side of things, right? So I try to keep things more in layperson's terms and just give my own experiences, right?
Which candidly, sorry to interrupt you, but like I find that more fascinating because I get kind of tired of hearing people tell me about what anxiety is supposed to be versus what I've lived or someone like you has lived. I think that's a much more interesting conversation. So yeah, please continue.
Yeah, no doubt. So I usually say that anxiety is future-oriented fear. A different way of saying it is that it is fear without an immediate stressor or threat in front of you, right? And the line blurs sometimes, right? If you're having a bad day where you're like, I am just so anxious, my body is so revved up, I'm afraid to be alive, if that makes sense, right? Being in my own body feels unsafe. It's kind of that vagueness, right? Of like, yeah, there's no person wielding a gun in front of you. But yeah, there's something there that makes you feel completely unsettled. You just don't know why, right? There is, this is kind of one of the things that I'm alluding to with like my work itself, right? Is like my first book, which is called Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety. I still love it, still stand behind it, recommend it, all that stuff. But I think at the time that I wrote it, like my view of the world was a little bit more simplistic, right? Of saying anxiety is the anticipation of things that scare you, when okay, you talk to enough people, you deal with enough anxiety yourself, it's really just that fear signal that you can't point to, right? Or at the very least, the fear signal without the immediate threat in front of you. So if we say, hey, there's a tiger in front of me, you're like, that makes sense, and I'm afraid. Whereas when you're thinking about a proverbial tiger that may or may not be in front of you in a week, that's more in the realm of anxiety.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I guess so. Part of your background too is that you've suffered from panic attacks. For someone listening who's maybe never had a panic attack, or maybe even someone that's never known someone who has, take me through what that's actually like. Not the textbook version of it, but like the real experience of it. And I think more importantly, I want to dive in a bit to how it affects your ability to navigate life after it happens.
Yes, that last piece is really important. So I want to try to remember to come back to that. So with a panic attack, right, you can kind of think of it as anxiety dialed up to a 10 or possibly even higher than that if you do that kind of scale. All the same symptoms or similar symptoms to anxiety, but just as intense and acute as can be, right? So I struggle to find the right word here because I wanted to say the nice thing about panic attacks, but there's nothing nice about them. Right?
There's nothing nice about them.
Yeah.
Do not recommend.
Yeah. The only piece here that is like any form of a silver lining, still not a silver lining, is that a panic attack is not something that lasts 3 days, right? You can be really nervous, really anxious, jacked up for a while, but a true panic attack lasts somewhere between a minute and 20 minutes on average. So the challenge is getting through that period. And if you think about the different symptoms, what's going on in your body, what's going on in your mind, again, you can kind of think of the same symptoms that you experience with anxiety, but dial them all the way up, right? So your heart will probably be racing. You will have a complete sense of lack of control and feel as though you are going to lose control. You're going to do something that, like, is out of character or isn't you or whatever. Usually sweating, inability to think clearly. It's very possible that you're going to have some sort of, temperature regulation issues where you may be like sweating profusely, but like in a way that doesn't feel right. It's not like, hey, I'm at the gym running on the treadmill. It's like my body feels like something is like squeezing through a tube of toothpaste, and like I don't know what's about to happen. And sometimes the way that the panic can resolve itself, not all the time, but like you have a cold sweat and you almost feel like that sweat kind of push through the tube all the way. And then you get a body temperature change. And at that point you're like, oh, that may have been my nervous system, like regulating that thing in some strange way. It's all frustrating and very harrowing to go through, again, just with the fear and loss of control and all of that. And the piece that is, like I said, is probably most important is when you look at something like panic disorder. So as in like, having multiple panic attacks over a short span and just getting to the point where you're like, it's not just, hey, I had a panic attack. It's panic has control over me and I don't know what to do with my life. The real hallmark there is the fear of the next one. So when you're like, hey, I had a panic attack, I got through it, I'll survive. That is very different from I am turning the corner proverbially in each room of my life and being like, where's the panic? Because it's going to come on again and it's going to crush me.
Yeah, I think that's the big piece right there. And I think that I've heard a lot of people describe it as like almost like a pending feeling of doom, or even feeling like you're going to die, right? It can be that extreme in some cases. And I think the other piece to it, at least in my experience as well, like it's always happened at inopportune times, right? Like it's never happening when you're just like chilling on the couch thinking about something. It's always like randomly, like in the shower or in the car. And it's like, I can't be having a panic attack right now. Like I have somewhere to be, I have something to do. Say more about the limiting aspects of it, because I think that there's something about anxiety itself can become very limiting. I think the walls start closing in. Avoiding one thing turns into avoiding most things. And then kind of before you know it, in a lot of cases, you've built a life around what you're scared of instead of what you actually want, right? So talk a bit about that, because I think that that's a part of anxiety that a lot of people don't understand. And I think that and I want to dive into how it impacts the people in your life in a bit, but talk about like that piece first.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of that same notion of fearing the next one, in the sense that, okay, you look at a term like agoraphobia, right? I think the actual like etymology of the term comes from like the meaning is like fear of the marketplace. If we expand that out to today's world, it's like fear of leaving one's house, because of the thought that if I go to the marketplace or I go to the library or I go to work, I'm going to find myself in such a bad mental state that people are going to laugh at me. I'm going to embarrass myself. I'm not going to be asked to come back to, my friend's house, a restaurant, whatever. And it's just, like you said, it's this incredibly limiting mindset where you just feel as though you can't do anything. And if you try to go do something, like you're going to mess something up and it's just going to make everything worse. I think one of the challenges in this space is, so, you had mentioned like the focus becomes the avoidance of these things that we don't want. The challenge in the space is like, there's a lot of folks who kind of go on like the toxic positivity side of things. And they're like, just think about what you want and it's going to be great. And like, forget about the anxiety. And it's like, no, dude, like if these people could, like, these are smart people and like wise people. If these people could do it, like they'd get up off their couch and they'd go to the grocery store and they'd have a good time. Like there are more things happening here that we need to work through. So what I would say is like the happy middle ground is like, yeah, sure. It can be helpful at times to remind yourself of the things that you want to do. But it can also be overwhelming, right? If you say, hey, like, yeah, I want to leave the house so I can go to Disney World or go to the museum or whatever. There's a little bit of hope and excitement there. And there's also that doom and gloom kind of like, well, I can't go to Disney World. I can't go to the marketplace because of this fear. And then you start kind of berating yourself, and you end up in this bad feedback loop where you're like, well, I should be able to do that. And it stinks that I can't. And I'm a loser and whatever. Right. And so you're just going to try to strike a balance between, number one, like doing that uncovering of the things that are driving the anxiety. And then number two, like, never fully losing sight of the things that you want to do one day, while also, caveat, making sure that you don't guilt trip yourself into being like, I'm such a loser. I'm never going to amount to anything. I feel so horrible. I'm making myself feel even worse than just the anxiety itself. It's kind of like meta anxiety, if you will. Making sure that like you always leave a little bit of space for in the future, one day when this thing becomes more manageable. Yeah, I'm going to go to Disney World. It's going to be a good time, but that might not be tomorrow night, the next night, whatever.
Yeah, I think so. The agoraphobia aspect is actually really fascinating that you brought that up, because I had done some research on that, because I was that person that always believed like it's just the fear of leaving your house. Like, why would someone have a fear of leaving their house, right? But it's more than that. It's bigger than that, because that's not where it starts. Just wake up one day scared of leaving your house, right? It's that those walls do close in. The world around you does become smaller, and you get there through avoiding the things that you feel, not even that you're going to like go to, brunch with your friends and make a fool of yourself. It's more of a like getting to the brunch, right? Or like it could be the little things even that prevent you from even thinking about going in the first place, right? And so that's the part that I find really fascinating, as you begin to kind of untangle some of this and really understand like what anxiety is, what avoidance is, what panic attacks are, right? Because it's not always as black and white as it might appear on the surface. I do want to talk a little bit about the people in your life, right? Because as you go through this, it can often feel very isolating. And there are, of course, hopefully we all have people in our lives that care about us, but they don't always understand what's happening. And I think that gap can also feel as isolating as the anxiety itself sometimes. So how did you help the people in your life understand what you were going through, or did you?
I think it's been a work in progress for sure. I think honestly, if I can kind of like map it back out, how I see it is like, and it's tough because like, obviously, saying these things on recordings and whatnot, like it's not meant to speak poorly of anybody. And we all have our, quirks and weirdness and issues and that kind of thing, right? I think I look back and I'm like, okay, my immediate family, all great, very loving people. We just all like, none of us does intimacy that well. And we don't always necessarily like take the big scary thing and put it out on the table, right? We kind of sometimes do a little bit more of the avoidance thing. And I think, again, nobody's fault, all well-intentioned and whatnot. But I think as I got older in life, I'm like, oh, I'm having trouble being intimate with people because I never did this before. I never learned this, right? And the real challenge is like, you talk about something like a mirror neuron, right? Where like you look at somebody and you see them doing something and you just subconsciously, you mirror it back to them, or you like, you see somebody swimming and you're like, oh yeah, look at that. Like the strokes, I'm just going to do what they did, And so a lot of our childhood programming is this subconscious, like I'm reading body language. I am subconsciously figuring out like, how do my parents deal with certain issues? And without having really any conscious clue of it, we're taking all that information in and saying, this is my view of the world. This is how I deal with problems. And then we start testing that subconsciously out in the world. And if we start running into problems, we're like, okay, something's going on here. I haven't been able to figure out what it is and identify that because this all runs on a subconscious level, but that's the work that I need to do, right? And so to kind of answer the question is like, I think what happened was like, never like my family, amazing people, great people, but like, you think about the different generations, right? It's like my grandparents went to war, and so it was very different times. And it was kind of like, hey, we don't talk about the big things. We just put our heads down and keep moving, right? And that can work in certain situations. For me, I'm like growing up in that milieu, if you will, that eventually became difficult where I think I subconsciously internalized this message of like, I either like can't be myself or I can't like always speak honestly about my own struggles. And I know, I know that my mom would be like, dude, really? You felt that way? And I'm like, I'm sorry, mom. I didn't, it wasn't a conscious thing. That's just what the brain picks up on, And I think as I started going to college and I was like, hey, I'm having issues like anxiety, depression, having trouble, not making friends, but like being intimate, going on dates and that kind of thing. I was like, okay, I'm running up against a wall that I can't identify. And eventually I was like, or somewhat quickly, I was like, this wall is anxiety, and maybe there's more work under the surface here, but the initial thing I have to deal with is the anxiety. And for me, right, how did I manage it? How did I communicate it? I look back and I'm like, oh, I went from not talking about this stuff at all to writing a friggin' book about anxiety and going on 200 podcasts about it. Like, hello, yeah. What was going on there?
And I mean, that alone is also a form of intimacy, right? Because
Yeah.
you're sharing that part of yourself with, strangers, for lack of a better way to put it. I'm just sitting here nodding along at everything you're saying about kind of like the generational, I guess, distinction with how we handle our problems and how we work through things. Because I grew up in a very similar family. Like my dad was in Vietnam, right? And I can probably count the number of times on one hand that he's ever talked about it, right? And I just think that like as you're speaking, I'm kind of thinking like, oh, maybe you have to compartmentalize that and not talk about it because it's so much that if you do start to speak on it, it opens up this flood of things that you just, how could you deal with that, right? And so here we are with our like anxieties and our things that we're like struggling with, and it's like, oh, it's so much easier to talk about these things. And I don't know, because I also like, I heard you as you were describing that, almost like not apologizing, but like definitely like kind of saying like, no, it was okay that we didn't do that, right? And I'm kind of thinking to myself, is it? Because I think there's this whole generation coming up behind us that wants to have those conversations, right? Like that's part of the reason I started this podcast, because I want to have those conversations that maybe I didn't get to with my family or, you know what I mean? Like people in my past. And so I think it's really interesting that we're really taking this approach now where it's like, no, we need to get this out. We need to sort through this because we want to be better. And I'm just fascinated by the difference, and it's really is generational to a degree.
Yeah, I mean, so many good threads to pull on there. I would say like from a pure standpoint of like, is it okay to have not had those conversations or whatever, right? It's like in a perfect world, we would have them, but like life is really messy. And when you're 7 years old, you have no idea what you're doing. You know what I mean? You don't understand that,
how to even articulate that, right?
Exactly. And, I think I try to give people credit in the sense of saying that like, it's not a like everybody's trying as hard as they possibly could. It's most people are doing the best they can with the information that they have. And part of that goes back to the brain, right? So when you do psychedelics, you will see that essentially there's this phenomenon, kind of like you're talking about with, going off to war, right? Is if your brain could have dealt with that like in an immediate way and said, I'm going to confront this and I'm going to resolve it, it would have. It couldn't, because that thing was so powerful that if you tried to do that, it would have destroyed you. And so it becomes a survival mechanism to say, I'm going to push this thing down subconsciously, because if I don't, I'm going to die. And if I don't die physically, I'm going to die psychologically. The problem is that survival mechanism eventually becomes the same thing that leads to a lot of problems down the road. And I'd say for most people, right? None of us can identify these things in real time. I don't think I would have been able to identify some of these things had I not gone and done psychedelics or a lot of therapy and worked through some of these issues. So my take on it is basically like, not necessarily generational trauma, but generational patterns. And it could be generational trauma for sure, but generational patterns of, I'm like, okay, let's go back 6 generations, right? I don't even know who my great great grandfather was or whatever, right? But you just think, what did my dad learn from his dad, and then my grandfather, what did he learn from his dad, and so on and so forth. And it's like we're all inheriting these patterns, and so we're being given these cards, we're dealt these cards, and we have to play that hand. It can be very hard for us to identify what's going on beneath the surface there. I think that for me, I'm like, I think I've done a lot of that. I still know I have a long way to go, but I'm like, if I were to ever have kids, like I'd like to believe that I'm going to impart some of these lessons on them and hopefully like start to change that pattern, right? We obviously look back in society and we're like, up until like maybe a decade ago, guys didn't talk about any of this stuff. That obviously wasn't healthy on a global and social scale. And so we're starting to change that narrative, but it takes time. And you see how all these threads are woven throughout, our families, our generations, and that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think I loved what you said about everyone's doing the best they can, because that actually is a belief that I carry through every moment of my life. But I would just add to that, but we can strive to do better, right? And I think there's some of us that I'm happy to acknowledge, I think it's one of those things, like anyone that's been to therapy, you talk about your parents and your childhood and all those things, right? And it's sure, my parents did the best they could, but right, there's a but. We could have a conversation now about maybe what we could have done differently, both of us, right, in the relationship. And I love what you said about the people I know that are the quote unquote healthiest today are people who acknowledge everything we're saying and say, you know what, but I'm going to interrupt those patterns. I'm going to make a different decision with my children. I'm going to, and maybe not always be successful with that, right? Because you're doing the best you can and today might suck, but you'll try again tomorrow. Right. And really try to interrupt those patterns and really try to show up differently for your kids. Or sometimes it's not even kids. Sometimes it's friendships or other people in your life, right, that didn't get that. And so that's why I love conversations like this so much, is because we need to be having more of that acknowledgement of hey, we're all trying, but we can do better. Here's how we can maybe start to do better. I have a theory about self-awareness. And I want to kind of get your take on this, because I think that we need a lot more of it in the world in many aspects. But I also think that there's a version of too much self-awareness, where, the constant monitoring, the constant checking in, the hypervigilance of your own inner state actually kind of feeds the anxiety as opposed to resolving it. What is your experience with that? Has self-awareness made things easier or harder for you, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, the answer, which is slightly a tangent, is coming back to Aristotle's golden mean, right? Is any extreme is probably not good. We could talk about self-awareness. We could talk about intelligence, whatever, right? I think we all know the person who's so smart, they can't talk themselves out of a paper bag, right? That's obviously not good. The same thing with self-awareness is if you are and I don't mean this in a negative sense, but if you have that neuroticism to be oh, I'm so sorry I did this, and oh goodness, I did this with my hands and I did that, that's not somebody that you want to talk to, right? And that's probably also not a life that you want to live if you're the person who's living like that. And so, yeah, it's moderation in all things, in the sense of and this is one concept that I'm working on, not really working on, but I just kick around in my head sometimes, is I love the fact that on the extremes, on either extreme, you have a label for those things. And then if you're in the middle, you're kind of just a healthy middle ground person, right? So the person who is, let's say, self-awareness, right? The person who is completely out to lunch and has no self-awareness, they're probably an idiot or something to that tune. The person who is so self-aware that they can't, again, they can't even get a sentence in, it's they are probably just, what's the right term for them? I mean, I guess I would say that
neurotic.
Yeah,
I don't know.
They're
Probably
neurotic, right? And so neither one of those things is a healthy place to be in. And so you're you need a healthy dose of neuroticism, as in just a little bit, to be okay, if I'm talking, I'm just pulling ideas out of thin air, but I'm if I'm talking and I notice that when I talk, I spit on the person in front of me by accident, you say, hey, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. And I acknowledge that I did that, right? But you're not apologizing for your entire existence. At the same time, it's on the other side of the coin, if you have no self-awareness at all, that's not good either, right? You're probably going to run through people, in a figurative sense of just being mean to them and doing things that they don't like and not respecting their boundaries and their feelings and all of that. And I think the other thing that I think about too, right, is on the intelligence front or something in that vein, right, is you talk to a lot of people, right? And you're I know I've had this belief in my head of, I'm if I could just be super smart and learn all these things, I'm going to be rich one day and I'm going to make a ton of money and I'm going to have a great life. And then you look around and you're like, oh my God, that dude made a ton of money. That dude made a ton of money.
And they're so dumb.
They're so dumb. And you're like, here's the problem is they are healthy dumb enough to have actually gone for it. Whereas I sat back and I was like, oh, look at all the risks. I can't do it. You know what I mean? So the intelligence, and it might be a different trait, right? But too much of that trait ends up holding you back. So you're looking for that golden mean.
Yeah. I mean, listen, I could talk about that all day. There's such, it's so fascinating to me because I've analyzed that very same thing before, right? Like some of us get stuck in that like analysis paralysis aspect of things where we're just like, I have to do more research. I have to figure this out before I can even get started. Right. And it's like, no, that person just got started. And, you know, while you were doing your analysis for 2 years, they've actually built a business or they've, you know, done X, Y, Z. It's so fascinating. It's so fascinating. I guess I bring this up because you mentioned that you spent years developing self-awareness, right? Through writing, therapy, reflection, and that you kept noticing that insight didn't automatically translate to behavior change. Why not? Why do you think that we keep doing things that we understand aren't serving us?
Yeah, I think it probably comes back to the like surface level versus deeper level thing, right? You can know that you do a thing. You might not always comprehend why you do that thing. And once you figure out why you do it and you gain leverage over yourself, you're like, this is what this thing is costing me, or this is the thing in my past that led to this. And I eventually, you know, come to terms with that thing in my past, or I resolve it to some degree. All of a sudden you're freed up to be able to change that behavior.
Yeah, and what do you think the cost is? Like, what allows a pattern to loosen? Is it time? Is it pain? Is it something else?
I mean, it's probably different for everybody. I will say that, like, you know, pain is a good teacher, and I don't mean that in like I don't mean that in a sexy way, right? Is like if you encounter enough pain, it's eventually going to push you to try something different. To be like, what I've been doing hasn't been working, and I have to be honest enough with myself to admit that, you know, and kind of just take that one on the chin. There are times where we can all be like, no, it's going to work, like, and get frustrated, you know, of like, oh, it hasn't worked yet, but it's going to, and I don't know why it's not working. After enough evidence stacks up, eventually you just can't refute the evidence anymore. And you're like, okay, I get it. I'll try something else.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think about this in my own life constantly, right? There's a gap between what I know and how I actually show up sometimes. And I'm curious if you found anything that bridges that, or whether it's just something that you kind of learn to live with more honestly.
I think this is where some alternative mediums such as therapy and psychedelics can be very helpful, right? To be like, to have an unbiased observer, whether it's, you know, your therapist or something in your mind that you're talking to because you're on some drugs, you know, you can't. So here's the thing, right? Is like, the analogy is sort of like you can't read the pill bottle when you're inside of it, right? So you need to somehow establish a way to get outside of it and then look back at it. So like a lot of people will say that ketamine is very helpful for that because it's a dissociative drug. So like it allows you to detach from yourself, which can be good, can also be terrifying, aka K-holes, right? If you're able to develop that perspective, you can then sometimes, if you're not scared out of your mind, you can then look at things from an unbiased view and say, oh, I see the machine. Now I'm outside of the machine and now I see the inside of it. Whereas when you're inside the machine, it's very hard to see what's going on. Or even, you know, could just be working with a therapist where they're like, oh, tell me more about this thing. Tell me more about that thing. And then they become that healthy mirror to say, hey, Brian, hey, Sean, I kind of noticed that you always do this, or you have a pattern of this. And at first, we're probably going to be a bit indignant, right? We're going to be, I don't do that. Like, what are you talking about? I've never done that before. Eventually, right, if somebody keeps pushing and is like, let me help you see this in like a safe way where like I'm not criticizing you, I'm not attacking you. Eventually that starts to seep in and you're like, I've been holding on to the fact that I don't do that because maybe it's part of my identity. And if I were to change, what would that mean for me? Who would I become? Right. So it can be deep and difficult work, but that's like, yeah, getting, you know, scratching below the surface. That's kind of the theme of what we've been talking about. And that's where a lot of the gains are.
Yeah, I don't know to what extent you are comfortable or you enjoy speaking about your experience with psychedelics. It's something that you've alluded to a couple times, and I think it's something that for me I've always been fascinated by. I think as someone that has suffered from panic attacks, I always feel like when I do that, I'm going to have a panic attack. So how did you kind of get over that I guess I don't know if it was a fear for you, but and get to the other side of that, because it sounds like it was an amazing experience for you.
Yeah, this is specifically with the psychedelics, right? Not necessarily,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Um,
Yeah.
I mean, some of it was it wasn't like it was that long ago, but let me think. 4 years ago, I think that was long enough ago for me to be a little bit less conservative, to be like, screw it, let's try it, and looking back, as we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, as you gain more information, as you read more articles, as you look at more headlines, you synthesize all that information and you're like, oh man, maybe it was not the best idea to like go to some kind of like, random place in Florida and do a bunch of ayahuasca, but like, hey, my friends went and I thought it'd be cool and I thought I'd learn something.
Yeah.
So I said, screw it, let's do it. And luckily nothing bad happened. But like, I guess, right, as you get older, I think, and I'm speaking in very broad strokes, but I'm like, when you're 20 and you're like, oh, something bad happened to one person, you are more likely to dismiss it and be like, can't happen to me, personal fable kind of thing. When you're 40 and you hear that, you start doing all the research and you're like, why did that happen? What happened to that person? How could that happen to me? And so, yeah, I was about 30 and I was just kind of like, you know what? My friends went, they had a good time. They said it was safe. They said it was a good environment, like a healthy environment with shamans and that sort of thing. And so, yeah, like I can't know for sure that this is the safest thing in the world, but I'm willing to give it a try. And honestly, at the time, I went in being like, a little bit rosy eyed. I was like, I'm going to go in, I'm going to have this experience, and it's going to be my next book, And the funny thing is that it might eventually be a part of the next book in however many years, but like coming out of the experience, there's a lot of integration that you have to do where like you get all this information from your psyche and you're like, sometimes it's a little overwhelming where you're like, I don't even really know what to do with that. Or I don't feel as though it has that large of an impact until I go implement what I learned, if that makes sense. Because otherwise you're like, I'm still living the same life. You know what I mean?
Yeah. The mind is truly so fascinating. Like just listening to you describe it, I'm just like, yeah, it's so fascinating. I want to talk about what you're building because it's connected to everything we've been discussing. You've taken your experience with anxiety, with self-awareness, with the gap between knowing and living, and you've turned it into something that helps other people. So talk to me about Get Out of Your Head.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So Get Out of Your Head is both a brand and a book series. Essentially the mission is to help folks with anxiety and depression. At some point, right? Like I might write another book. I've got 2 right now. So the first one's on anxiety. The second one is on depression. As right, as we have this conversation and I have other conversations and just live my life and learn things, you start to see that, there's more to the anxiety than just meets the eye. And so, I continue to help folks with anxiety and depression and emotional issues, but at the same time, right, they're all interwoven to a degree. And so I guess what I really do, right, is like my thought process, going back to the fact that I'm not a clinician, is I don't say this as like, the suffering Olympics and I get the gold medal, but I would say like, I think anybody who's been through a lot of anxiety and a lot of depression knows that it hurts a lot and it holds you back in life. And it really just stinks in general. You encounter a lot of pain, not just the, anxiety, depression itself, but the knock-on effects of like, okay, well now I can't leave the house, or now I'm not doing that thing because I don't know how to handle it. Right. So all of that pain is my fuel to be like, I want to go out, and as I talk to people and I know just how many people deal with anxiety and depression and, similar conditions, I'm like, I see all that pain that I went through and I'm like, how can I use that to help other people on their own journeys? That's what I vibe on. And that's the kind of work that really lights me up. So that's what I continue to try to do. maybe there'll be a third book in the future. I think the tough thing is just, life's expensive. There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of work out there to, just to put food on the table and whatnot. And so being an author is not always the most lucrative endeavor, but I'm holding on to hope that at some point I'll be able to do a little bit more with it than I currently am.
Yeah, I love it. And I love the mission, and please don't quit, because we need more people like you out there, just even engaging in this discussion. I guess for someone listening right now who, is in that situation, right? The walls are closing in, they're avoiding, maybe they feel like no one around them gets it. Maybe they've done the work and, built the self-awareness, read all the books. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say just because I don't know their exact situation, but I think a blanket of advice would be just to find somebody else that you can talk to about this stuff. It could be a therapist, it could be a sibling, a friend, a parent, a coworker, whatever. The isolation piece is what kills you the most, right? If you are on an island dealing with these things, it's going to make it 10 times worse. I will also say, right, it's it doesn't, I know maybe not everybody would love this, especially not HIPAA compliant people, but I'm it might not even need to be a person. We're in the age of AI. If you want to talk to ChatGPT, obviously don't put sensitive information in there that you don't want to get leaked or potentially get leaked. But if you're hey, I want to work through some of these issues and I don't need to fill in every single detail, look, that is an outlet. That's a source that you can use. So don't be afraid to try that out. I'm not saying, it will be the best thing for every single person, but again, get outside of yourself, talk to other people, work through those emotions, but don't do it alone, because when we're alone, that's not a good place to be.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I do think about the AI piece, because there's so much, crap out there right now, but I think there are tools that I'm seeing come online every day that I'm oh, wow, this could be a tool that really does help somebody, especially in a space like mental health. So yeah, I don't have specific advice to give in that realm, to your point, but it's definitely something that you should look into. Even if it's not ChatGPT, there are apps and there's specific tools for this where people are focusing on building something to help people in these types of situations. So, Brian, thank you so much for sharing your story with me today. And thank you just for being honest about everything. I know that sometimes, especially, it is a very intimate conversation to be having. And so I really do appreciate you being vulnerable and you sharing your story with us. Please let our listeners know where they can find you and learn more about your work.
Yeah. Thank you, Sean. And thanks for having me. Best place to find me would be getoutofyourhead.com. And then on Instagram, the handle is getoutofyourhead.
Thanks for spending some time with me today. Choosing to step off autopilot and think differently about your life takes work, and I don't take it lightly that you're here. If today's episode resonated, the best way to support the show is to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And whenever you're ready to go deeper, whether through free worksheets, guided audio reflections, or one-on-one coaching, you can find everything over at thinkoutsideTheLines.com. Be well, and I'll catch you next time.